In 2007, the first iPhone was announced by Steve Jobs. In addition to this, the Iraq War was halfway over and Beyoncé's Irreplaceable was on top of the Billboard Top 100. The time between 2007 and 2023 is the same length of time as that between the Great Depression and the end of World War II. The time frame between 1929 and 1945 is arguably one of the more important time periods in the history of the United States. How was the US economy revived after the negative effects of the 1929 stock market crash? How did the US become the first country to develop nuclear weapons 16 years later? What was it like for the middle and lower class citizens during this time of change? And what lasting effects came from this time period? Today we'll be discussing the effects of the Great Depression and World War II on the average American.
The tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii.
An American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima.
3, 2, 1, no.
Specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
The 1920s, also known as the Roaring Twenties, was a time of economic growth for the economy and working class. Because of this, Americans could spend much more time relaxing instead of working. Jazz became popular during this time with artists such as Louis Armstrong. All of that changed after the stock market crashed in 1929. While it didn't immediately impact the average American, the stock crash would mark the beginning of the Great Depression. 4 years after the stock market crash was when unemployment was at an all-time high of 25%. Families got through these tough times by building and resourcing what they could themselves. Thousands of people grew their own produce to create a reliable food source. New legislation was put into place to prevent an economic collapse as devastating as that of 1929. In seeking a way to end the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt created the New Deal. The New Deal was made up of smaller government programs that provided jobs and financial aid to the average American. Social Security is a program that was created under the New Deal and still exists today. Other programs like the FDIC were created to restore trust in the banking system. While these new programs did start to repair the economy, something much bigger restored the US economy. Despite Germany dominating much of Europe, the US decided to stay out of the first 2 years of the war. The event that brought them into the fight was the December 7, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. The US economy was jump-started by the war effort as the production of supplies for the war created thousands of jobs. Rations were used to ensure that the military had enough supplies to fight the war. Because of this, 20 million people planted their own gardens. These gardens would become known as Victory Gardens. Because men were off fighting, women became welders, electricians, riveters, and filled many other positions essential to the war effort. This would be a first for society as these jobs were previously thought to be only fit for men. Many African Americans who fought in the war believed in the Double V campaign, the idea that victory against Germany would lead to a victory for African Americans in the fight for civil rights. Not all minorities saw growth during the war. Executive Order 9066 put anyone with Japanese ancestry in internment camps where they would be held for the remainder of the war. People believed that anyone who had Japanese ancestry would be spying for Japan. With the Battle of Berlin ending the war against Germany and Europe, the US turned its focus to the war in the Pacific. Because the Japanese believed in fighting to the death, the US resorted to firebombing and eventually nuclear weapons. The Manhattan Project relied on the brightest of minds from across the country to make 2 successful bombs. After dropping the 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan would eventually surrender, ending the war. The biggest outcome for the US was the revival of its economy after the Great Depression. It is important to remember World War II as it is the event that got the US out of the Great Depression, established new alliances, and brought social reform because of women and African Americans holding important roles during the war. It is also important to remember those who fought to protect our freedom. Speaking of which,
my name is Bill Ewens, and I'm reached the age of around 101. I'm going on 102, but we'll see if I can make it. Great Depression, I had it quite easy because my father was a doctor. He worked for the mining company, and it was just like back in the old days when you see movies, that company doctor. he was the typical company doctor. Everybody had gardens. The city of Virginia, where the baseball field is now, and some of that area, that was all gardens. And the city of Virginia maintained those gardens and kept them nice. And if you wanted a garden, all you had to do was sign up in the city of Virginia and they'd have a plot for you. And they did a lot for you. And that was one of the greatest things. We had a family across the alley from us that were not very, I wouldn't say they were poor, but they had to play close to the vest. And Bob, the oldest, he was able to drive the Model T. And he would drive every afternoon the Model T up to the north side and pick their vegetables and stuff like that. So there was a lot of people had that farming and growing instinct in them, so that they thrived, I think. Well, I think probably Pearl Harbor attack was the biggest thing that implanted and made an impression on me. And of course, everybody was incensed at the time, so I decided that I would join the service. Cool. I wanted to get into flying, but my eyes were not good enough. You needed to have 20/20 vision before you could get into any kind of a program that they had. So I got into civilian pilot training, which just required 20/30 vision. So that was an awfully good program, because by the time I finished secondary training in that course, I had a private pilot's license. And then went on into cross country, and that practically ended my career, because I was just about ready to make my final voyage to Mason City, Iowa, to see how I could navigate and plan the flight and all that stuff. And the Army decided they needed us guys, even though we only had 20/30 vision, or there was some minor faults. We didn't pass the test. So my little excursion with civilian pilot training ended right there. When I say they took me down, they got me out of the program. What they did was ship me down into Randolph Field, where we were part of the Army, and I was a regular Army. While in civilian pilot training, we were just sort of associates with the service. We weren't really in the service, so. It was official now that I was a buck private. They weren't ready for us. They took me out of training, but they weren't ready for us, so they sent us off to Jonesboro, Arkansas, where we went to school for 6 months, just to wait until they finished the second class so we could start our flight plane. And that was a nice time to get a little rest, but I mean, we didn't do anything. And I would have liked to have spent that time finishing my cross-country course. But then, that's the Army. The Army, you don't argue with the Army. So when we finished at Jonesboro, Arkansas, they called us back to Randolph Field, and I took tests to see if I could still had 20/20 vision. Well, I was doing a lot of reading, so my vision went to 20/40, so I was no longer able to fly. So they asked me whether I wanted to do. They gave me a choice of going into radio school or armory. So rather than armor, I decided I liked Morse code and all that stuff. So that's how I got into that. And my final test in radio school was when we got our airplane, and we got a brand new B-29. And that was a fine plane. It was one of the first planes that had airtight compartments, and you could smoke cigarettes and drink coffee and all that sort of stuff That sounds rather glamorous because when we actually went on these flights, it wasn't that great. I liked the camaraderie that we had when we were finally on Guam. We went overseas, and I think I spent a little more than 6 months overseas before the war ended. But I got in an argument with the barracks chief when we were in Guam, and he didn't like it that I and a bunch of guys played bridge, and he thought maybe we should be playing some other simple game that he liked. So I complained to the officer of the day, and he put us in a different barracks, and so some of us radio operators and some of us bombardiers and some of us gunners, we all got together because we had one thing in common and played bridge, so we had a lot of fun. And why do we have so much time? Well, when we came overseas, our airplane commander buzzed one of the towers. So as a penalty, we weren't allowed to go on any missions for 6 weeks. And in 6 weeks, the war was over.
In closing, it is important to remember the critical 16 years that passed between 1929 and 1945. The American people lived off what they had during the Great Depression and laid the groundwork for future social reform and equal pay for women and civil rights for African Americans. The legislation put in place after the Great Depression and World War II is there to ensure that we as a society can continue moving forward without falling into the shortcomings of the past. And that is why this time period is significant to American history.